This is Scott Thompson from Vantage Optics. Going to show you how to install the Big 3 kit, at least as many steps as we can on this van. This is our personal shop van, so we will do what we can. The very first step is remove the air intake. This being a V10, should be very similar to all of the gas engines. Diesels are different, but we don't offer Big 3s for those just yet, so stay tuned. In order to remove this, pull it out of the front cowl, turn it up a bit, and pull it off. There is a tang here, make sure that doesn't break off. To remove the air filter side, flip it up, pull this thing off. Air cleaner and everything comes off as one unit. It's a good time to change your air cleaner if you haven't done that yet. The next step here is we will need to remove the serpentine belt from the alternator. This allows for proper access to the cable in the back here without it potentially touching ground. I'm doing this with everything hot, still connected. I don't recommend that, but if you're careful and understand what is hot and not, that's just fine. So what I'm going to do here is try and set this thing so that you can see. And I go under there, and we're going to use a 1/2-inch breaker bar and pull down on the tensioner so that we can remove the serpentine belt from the alternator there. Once you get it aligned right, pull down. You can take the belt loose. I'm going to leave the tool on it so that it's easier later. So now I recommend you pull the belt down and just set it on top of the water pump there. That way you don't have to worry about rerouting everything too intensely. We'll move on to the next step where we remove this hardware here and then the 2 front bolts. Alright, so we're in here now. We got to remove, I'm going to remove just this single bolt that mounts to the alternator for the back bracket. You can remove the whole bracket. There's no penalty for that. We may have to do that. I don't think that's the case, but we'll remove that one here. All of this hardware gets reused, so don't lose it. I did already pre-loosen this alternator, so that's why it did just flop a little. Then we'll remove the bottom hardware here. These are longer bolts. This engine is completely as hot as it could be right now, so also don't recommend doing that. So you pull those out. Make sure you note the positions. It is easier with an electric ratchet. It's not difficult without, but it makes it quicker. Okay, that bolt almost lost, but I found it. Okay, so at this point, this alternator is now loose and can rock forward, and that is very warm, so I need to get a glove. All right, we're back and we're gloved. So it's warm on this one right now, but can kind of rock it so that it sets like this. Now, keep in mind the original position of your wire, how it comes out, the factory wire, and then we'll pull this boot back here. And you'll see there's a single stud here for the mount. Now keep in mind this is still energized for my setup, so I want to keep that in mind, that when you're doing this, it doesn't go and touch anything that it shouldn't. And what we'll do is we will loosen that enough to be able to put on the new cable. Alright, so this is the big 3 kit. These are the components that come in it. You've got the main battery cable from the alternator to the battery. You've got 2 ground cables. One goes from the battery to the engine block, and the other goes from the engine block down to the chassis. You got your engine block bolt, and you got your chassis bolt, and then the positive and negative military battery terminals. We won't go over how these mount, but there are pictures in the instructions that allow for some creativity in making that happen. New lugs may need to be crimped onto the original wires, but that depends on your application. Alright, so you got your new cable. The way that I personally do this, I tape up the battery end so that it'll go to the new lug, so that once you connect the power cable here to the alternator and you have your factory wire there on the alternator that may be hot, you don't run risk of arcing that on anything. So the smaller end here, this little 1/4 inch guy, goes on the lug right here. So it's also wise to make sure that your throttle cables, that you put this on the correct side of the throttle cables. That way you're not pushing the throttle cables back funny as you go to install it. So with that in mind, we will remove this nut. We will slip on the new cable here. And what we got to note is you got to note proper clearance everywhere around so that it's not touching any metal, because that is a problem. And what we'll do is we'll bring this straight up. So if you picture the alternator is right here, this mount is vertical here. Bring this wire also vertical. That way it takes up space up here that's not being utilized currently. So we'll get that in position there, and we'll snug it down. And oftentimes, once you're tight, I think my boot here might be just about done tearing a bit. It's totally normal, unfortunately. These things get quite warm. So I'll tighten this one up all the way. Obviously making sure it's not touching anything. Okay, and we'll try and slip this guy on without breaking it. Probably will break though. And that'll probably be okay, at least for my application, since I don't have an option here. So at this point here, the alternator can now be rocked back into position and can be reinstalled. And you can see there how the cable, if it comes vertically there, it misses everything. You're on the correct side of the throttle lines here, and then on this other end here, we'll route it back up here behind the harness and near the oil fill tranny line here, and up to the battery, making sure that we're not touching anything that can abrade, and if we do, that we isolate it, and we'll go over that, how that works. All right, so we jumped ahead a little bit here. We got the alternator completely tightened back down. You can see the line is aimed up like we intended. We have all of the bolts tight, we got the belt back on, and so the vehicle is now functional again. The power wire cable here, we routed up. Ours is a little bit peculiar. There's a lot of stuff going on here. The point is to route it clear of everything. It'll route over here to the battery. Still taped. We did disconnect the battery now, because when we're going to go fiddle with this, we don't want it's way too easy to make a mistake over here. So what we'll do is we'll pull the tape, we'll pull the bolt here, we will slip this guy in underneath the factory side over here. So we got other stuff. We got a winch line, we got isolator for a house battery, all sorts of stuff going on here. But that's the advantage of these military battery terminals, is they allow a bunch of flexibility and stack up with the bolt assembly instead of just off the single side. This piece up here is a battery, a Bluetooth battery monitor. Totally an afterthought, and we're just monitoring things just to make sure everything's good to go. But so we'll pull the cable, the tape off here, we'll install this here, and then we'll move on to the ground side. And then once that's all done, we still need some access here to make sure all these wires are isolated properly, but we'll route everything proper, get all back together. So we'll do it step by step. it's always wise to assume when we're doing this job that things are hot and that they're energized at all points. I know for a fact this one here is not, however this line I'm touching right now is. So just make sure it's make sure you know your system, if you've got auxiliary batteries or backup or house or however you're doing it, that everything is as safe as you can get it. Alright, so to do this one proper, we're going to route this bolt this way and then through. Alright, and that stacks up nicely so that there's no issues. Do need to trim very slightly the back side here. So these are things you look at. We're going to have to trim the heat shrink from back here because the way it overlaps, it's contacting some of the heat shrink. So we'll trim that away real quick and then we'll get back. All right, we're all connected. Everything's back together here. All this is tight. We're zoomed in here to show that there's about a you know, half a finger's clearance from the AC line here to the new line. It does not hit the box at all down on the bottom side. But this is a good example of clearance issues that need to be accounted for. What we like to do is use something like 1/2-inch rubber hose and a zip tie. And what we'll do is we'll create an isolator that works very, very well. So the way this works is you put let me get it here real quick. So you loop it around the part you're going to isolate so that it looks like this, and then what you do is you put it around the opposite side of where you're going to put it, and you can put it together. Now this isn't done obviously, so you now manipulate the rubber piece under there, and we're going to roll this thing around so the tab here works, and we're going to pull that nice and tight. And what that does is that's completely isolating the battery line from the metal line here. Always make sure with any kind of time you put a tab up like this that you trim it with a nice set of flush cuts so that there's no way you can cut yourself. It's a quick lesson that always catches you. So that's what we'll do with most all of this other stuff. We will isolate these. This is something you don't want to take too lightly, because this chafes and it touches ground, you will have a problem, because we are going directly from the battery to the alternator, and there's no stoppage of power once that goes. So I want to make sure everything is nice and steady. All right, so after you're done with the positive side, get that all done and isolated, all completely situated in there and safe, move on to the negative side. And the easiest way is to connect, let's go the right way here, is to connect the grounds to the block, zip tie those two together, connect them back to back to the block with the bolt, and then be able to run these things out to the correct positions to the engine and the chassis. All right, and then when you run the grounds, you run them from the block there. You'll end up running the longer one. You can run up and around to the negative terminal here. Connect that. Make sure it's all isolated. This one's a little less critical because it's a ground. However, common practice would be that you isolate it as best you can to make sure it's not going to contact anything. The shorter lead there that goes down, make sure it's also isolated. Make sure it does not contact any of the rotating pulleys or fan. This is all important stuff that matters. And then down at the bottom, the ground connection to the chassis, if you've got a steering damper, you can use the upper position there. If you don't have a steering damper, you can use those two existing holes in the chassis, tap them M10 1.5, and you can connect your ground there. At the same time, also make sure that all of your routing, kind of hard to tell, but make sure all the routing is clean and not going to contact anything. After you're all said and done, you got your intake put back on, start up the car, make sure everything's good. I'm using a Fluke battery meter here. We're showing 14.5 volts nearly at idle, that's not cold. Voltage will be a little bit hotter or higher cold, a little bit lower hot. So we're doing really good work here with a standard output alternator, about 150 amp alternator. So big improvement from a very small job. Job does take about, on average, about 2 hours. So have that in mind when you're getting it done.